Anybody know who Alan Turing is? Yeah, so he was a mathematician, and I think they named the Turing test after him. It's the test to discern whether an AI can become human. There's like they call it the Turing test. But he was also a code breaker in World War II. And what was interesting is that the Germans had these ciphers that they used, and if you're familiar with World War II history, their U-boats were kicking our tails. I mean, they were just winning the war in the water. But this mathematician, Alan Turing, he's a young man. He figured out how to break their code, their cipher, and part of it was he approached it with a completely different way of thinking, and a lot of that comes down to young people who are brought up in a healthy environment where creativity is encouraged. They can think outside the box, and so this is a good thing. So anyway, they say that basically he was one of the most powerful men in all of World War II because he essentially ended the war with Germany 2 years earlier. So we would have eventually won, they guess, but because he broke these ciphers and we were able to defeat the U-boats, that it ended the war in 1945 as opposed to 1947. So he saved, hundreds of thousands of lives and lots of money and lots of great stuff. Unfortunately, the UK government repaid him by attempting to chemically castrate him so that he committed suicide. Yeah, so it's a sad story. It was a different culture then. He was a practicing homosexual, and he was open about it, which you shouldn't do at that time. So he was arrested for indecency and a bunch of other stuff after the war, and they basically told him, we're going to imprison you, and we're going to chemically castrate you, which I don't really know what that means. I can guess, but I didn't want to look it up, so I just figured I'll leave it. But essentially, he got cyanide, and he committed suicide, and that was the end of it. So kind of a sad story. But it's amazing if you go to the same country where he was, where he lived, and if you went into the same house and got a computer and got on Facebook or Insta, whatever it is, and you started saying the same things that the people said who arrested him, then the cops would come to your house and arrest you because there's no freedom of speech in that country now. And if you say the very things that caused him to get arrested, you will get arrested now. So it's shifted so fast. It's amazing to me how much culture changes and how quickly. There was a gentleman who attended our church here who was a police officer. I talked to him last year, and he was telling me that in the 60s, he was an officer in the Bay Area. They would set up, I think they're called like some kind of honey trap or something, where he would go to what was known to be a gay bar. He was a young man, and they would coach him on how to dress up. He would wear super tight jeans, and he would dress a certain way, and then they told him, like, you need to act this way. So he would act like he was a homosexual man, go into a bar, and then as soon as someone hit on him, he'd whip out the cuffs and arrest the dude on the spot and take him to jail for, I don't know what the statutes were back then. So, and then at that time, we had what's called the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it listed all of the mental disorders, and homosexuality was considered to be a mental disorder. So you were sick if you practiced this. So all that to say, you take our culture from 1940 to 1960, and it was very clear, and then you go 60 years later, and now it's completely different. So how does that change so quickly? How do our values just reverse themselves? Homosexuality is wrong to if you don't support homosexuality, you're wrong. Well, we find the exact same thing when it comes to the issue of women in ministry. If you look at all the literature, all the theological work, all of the arguments, everything you could think of, say, before 1950, crickets. You would find absolutely nothing, because there was no argument. Everyone knew this is what the Bible says, and even if the Bible didn't say that, culture functioned a certain way. And so within a short amount of time, we have reversed everything to where if you hold the view that people held 60 years ago, then you're some sort of like hateful, bigot sort of person. And you don't express or represent the love of Jesus. So we have an issue that we have to get through. and we've been discussing it for several weeks now. I hope I haven't melted your brain with all of the boring breakdown of the syntax and the grammar and the etymology and all that other stuff. But we only have 2 more weeks, and we're going to hit several things today. We're going to look at deaconesses, and the same section was in your last week's packet that we didn't get to. And then we're going to look at 1 Corinthians 11. All right, so I get this question a lot. Why doesn't our church have deacons? Because if you go to our website, there's no deacons listed. If you look at any of our literature, have you ever heard me talk about, well, the deacons are doing this, the deacons are doing that? My answer is, we do have deacons. We just don't use the title. But we're going to break that down today and examine why. And why are there some churches that are actually conservative and they'll have deaconesses? You know, like very conservative churches, and they'll have deaconesses. Well, it's because there's some ambiguity and some fuzziness when it comes to these verses. All right. So we are in 1 Timothy. If you would open up your Bibles there, that would be swell. This will feel more like a Bible study tonight because we're actually going to be just focusing on 2 verses. Okay, 1 Timothy 3, verses 1 to 13. It's on the screen. I'm going to read it from the ESV version. This is Paul writing to Timothy about the church there, I think in Ephesus. Or is he writing from Ephesus? Doesn't matter. Here we go. 1 Timothy 3, verse 1. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, and not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. Deacons, likewise, must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. Their wives, likewise, must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. And let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their own households well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. Okay, so that is our passage. Let's look at our conundrum. The first problem that we have is the ambiguity of a Greek word called gune. Now, if you have... let's see, 1 Timothy 3, if you look at verse 11, mine begins, the ESV begins with their wives. Does anybody else have any other translations? Something different?
Women.
It says their women?
Yeah, in the same way, the women.
The women.
That's an NI.
Mine says the wives.
The wives. Okay, so here's the problem that we have. In the Greek, the word gune can mean woman or wife, and there's no way to tell it apart. So either translation is right. And this is one of the problems with languages, that they don't cross over. We specify in the Koine Greek language, it's not clear. Now, most of the time in the sentence, you can tell what the person means. If Paul's speaking to a group of women, we know Paul's not married. He's not married to a group of women. You would know he's talking to women. But if it says, Peter went back home to visit his gune, you'd think, well, it's probably referring to his wife. It doesn't say that, but you get the point, right? So the automatic problem is we don't know if this means woman or wife. And you'll find respectable translations on both sides of the issue. Okay, now if that wasn't a big enough problem, we have another one, and that is, in the Greek here, the way it's I guess you would call it the grammar, is that it's not clear whether this is a possessive noun or a common noun. So translators have to make choices here. they will either say the women or they will say their women. Now, let me show you what we're talking about here. If we look at the translations here, this is also in the middle to bottom of page 1. 1 Timothy 1:3 in the ESV says their wives. So the translators chose to make it a possessive noun, their, and to translate it as wives. So they made two choices there for you, their wives. But if you go down to the King James, they also say their wives. But go down to the Christian Standard, and then it says wives. So they've said this isn't a possessive noun, this is a common noun. So it's not their wives, it's just wives. Then you go down to the NASB 95, which is also highly respected, and it says women. Not their women, but women. So you have essentially a noun, and it's not clear whether it's a possessive or common noun, and then it's not clear whether he means wife or woman. And so you have on the top of page 2 4 logical options of 1 Timothy 3. So if it's used as a possessive noun and you refer to gune as women, then it would mean their women. Well, who is there? That's the deacons' women. So why did the deacons have women? It's believed that the deacons had servant girls in the church. So what Paul is talking about in verse 11 is that they're servant girls. In other words, the deacons are organizing and doing work, and they have people that are helping them, and the servant girls who are serving need to be, verse 11, dignified, not slanderous, not sober-minded, faithful in all things. And this is a possible translation. Okay, so the next option is gune means wives, but also as a possessive noun. And so it says their wives. And this is what the ESV has chosen. So when you read verse 11, it's not their servant girls, it's the deacons' wives. Must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded and faithful in all things. So it's giving a description. Well, so is Paul talking about servant girls, or is he talking about the deacons' wives? Okay, now we go down to option number 4. And if this is a common noun, then what this means is he says deacons this, deacons that, deacons this, and then he says the women likewise must be dignified, meaning the women deacons. So you have women then who are deacons, and this is the standard. The female deacons, likewise, must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded and faithful in all things. And that is a reasonable translation. Now, the last one is gune means wives with a possessive noun, and it would mean that it's referring to deacons who have wives, and their wives are also deacons. Okay, so we have 4 options here, and who knows what he's talking about? Now, option number 1 is the least popular one. So it usually comes down to 2 and 3. These are either wives of the deacons or they are women who are deacons. So that's the first problem. Okay, any questions on that? Yes, ma'am.
It's not really a question, but I was just noticing that when he's talking about the congregation leader, at the beginning of the chapter, he's talking about his wife. So then I would automatically just think that when it starts talking about the deacons, that it was talking about their wives.
Sure.
It's talking about the pastor's wife has to be a certain way, and the deacon's wives have to be a certain way.
Where is he talking about the pastor?
The congregation leader must be above reproach. He must be faithful to his wife, and then let's see.
Oh, I see, in verse 2.
Yeah, wait, no, maybe I'm. No, maybe I'm. I don't know. Maybe I forgot where I was.
Okay, no problem. If you find it, let me know. All this to say that if you look at your major translations and respectable translations like the ESV, the NASB 95, the Christian Standard, they come out with different ways to take this. Yes, sir?
The versions that use their wives, is there any there in the Greek?
No, but Greek doesn't work that way. It's inflected, so you wouldn't have it anyway. Like when Jesus says, "It is finished," that's one word. So it doesn't translate the same way. Yes,
In the context of the passage
Sure. But does it say the word husband?
It does where it talks about only,
The husband of one wife.
yeah, it's twice.
Is it the
Yeah,
same
deacons
word?
be the husband of one
That's
wife,
verse
man.
12.
Yeah, so
To me,
there,
that sort of include that.
Yeah.
It probably would be wife rather than,
well, that's the way the ESV is going to take it.
yeah.
Justin.
Yeah, we also have to take into context that this was written to a specific group, and if that group had women deacons, this group would know exactly what he's talking about, and we don't happen to know that. So I could see why there's confusion, because if they did have women deacons, he doesn't need to clarify wife or not, because they already know because it's written specifically to them.
Yeah. So that's the problem. We're just removed 2,000 years later, and the Lord has kept certain things unclear to us for a variety of reasons. So,
Is the word wife, at the beginning in chapter verse, 2, is it the same word as when it's talking about the deacons?
When talking about deacons and overseers.
yeah, I don't have my Greek Bible in front of me, but as far as I know, that would be the same word.
Okay, because it's pretty clear that it's talking about the overseer's wife.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but also remember in the Greek, literally, it doesn't say the word wife. It just says a one-woman man, or a one-wife man. So you could translate it because, for instance, the ESV says the husband of one wife, but I think the NASB 95, I think it says a one-woman man. So again, you have, so I don't want to spend a lot of time arguing on this, but my point is that it's not clear, and you have major translations that people respect that are on both sides of it, because the ESV and the NASB 95 land differently. So,
So if it's here about the deacons, whether it's a man or a woman, your position or the church's position is we don't have deacons. Why wouldn't we have deacons if it's scriptural?
oh, well, we'll get there. Yeah. So, and, yes.
And then if I could just throw in too, my commentary doesn't mention that, they do not lead on the same level of authority as a congregational leader or an elder in my Jewish study.
Yeah, certainly a diaconoi does not have the same authority as a presbyteros or an overseer, an episkopos, as we say in the Greek. So what we're translating as overseer, you're using congregation leader. That's what they're saying. Verse 2.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. No, clearly there is not the same authority. Okay, so we have this description of a deacon, and we went over this. If you were here for ecclesiology, we covered this issue, but we're going to go over it again really quickly. So one of the arguments is the position of deacon an office? Like people will say, well, there's the office of deacon, and it's not even clear what people mean. And they'll say, well, I was ordained as a deacon. I have a friend who was literally just ordained as a deacon, I think, a month or two ago, right? And churches have deacons, and they have the position. Now, in some cases, we have, so like, say, Mark at our church, Jackson, he's a strong evangelist. Do we call him Evangelist Mark? No, we just call him Mark. So one of the issues here is this a title? Is this an office that comes with it a title, or is it just something that someone does? Because we clearly don't call Mark the evangelist. We don't call him the evangelist. We just call him Mark. We don't call him Evangelist Mark. So let's break this down, okay? So I would say the majority of Protestant churches appoint men to the office of deacon. And the Nine Marks ministry, they break down their ministry that's really focused on ecclesiology, and they break it down as an office. They say that the two offices of the church are the pastor, which they recognize comes from the two words overseer or presbyteros. Okay, so you have a pastor, and then you have a deacon, and those are offices in the church. Which again, it's not clear what they really mean by that. But now, look down in the middle of your page 2, 1 Timothy 3. It says, if anyone aspires to the office of overseer. Well, there it is right there. It says office of overseer. Well, if only it were that simple. It says, he desires a noble task And then he goes on to say, 7 verse later, deacons likewise must be, and then he goes on to give standards. So the argument here is that Paul refers to the overseer as an office, and then he says likewise, and therefore we would say that the position of deacon is also an office. So the office of overseer, likewise deacons, and we would say the likewise transfers the office over to the deacons. Okay, so that's where they get this, and there's really no other proof text for this. Like the office of deacon is solely based off transferring the likewise to the deacon. Okay, are you with me so far? All right, so here's the problem with all of this. There are strong indications, in my opinion, and by the way, I stand alone on this one. The majority of Christendom is against me. So I'm just being honest with you, okay? A lot of Christendom is against me. That we don't have titles, we don't need titles, and there's no such thing as an office. So let me explain. Bottom of page 3. Argument number 1 is likewise. So Paul connects elders to the deacons in 1 Timothy 3:8 with the word likewise. But my question is, does the text demand that likewise connects the description of an elder to a deacon, or was he referring to the moral standards? So he says, elders, so verse 2, therefore an overseer, or the office of overseer, is this, this, and this. And then he says, likewise, deacons, this, and this, and this. So is he transferring the moral standards, or is he transferring the office? So go back and read chapter 3, verse 1. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task, therefore an overseer must be. And then you go down to verse 8, deacons likewise. So is the likewise transferring the office, or is it transferring the moral standards?
I think the moral standards, because he then repeats them, and he didn't repeat the portion about seeking the office.
Okay. Is there any way to defend this position other than just this is what I think? Is there any definitive thing that would make you think, yeah, this clearly transfers the office? See, go ahead.
Well, does the word, because there's all these trick words here.
I know.
Does the word office really mean office in Greek, or could it mean position or something else?
That's the
That's
next.
a clue.
That's the next point.
Okay. All right.
We're gonna hit that because there's a
All right.
lot of problems with that. Okay. So, all that to say, that I don't think it's clear. Now, to me, when I read it naturally, I don't think that it transfers the word office. But I could be wrong because I don't think it's clear either way. But it is strange to me that the entire argument of deacon being an office is based upon the transference of one unclear word. Okay. All right, no one's scowling, no hands up, so I think we'll move on. All right, now this is where it gets more complicated. Argument number 2 is the translation. Now, the word office appears 5 times in the Bible. Okay, so we find it in Acts, Hebrews, and 1 Timothy. And every time Paul or the writer of Hebrews uses the word office, he's usually referring, in the four of the 5 cases, he's referring to the defunct position of the Old Testament priest. So there's no priest in the New Testament. We don't have them other than Jesus, the high priest. Okay? So he takes this word in Greek, and he uses it in Acts because he's quoting Psalms, and then the writer of Hebrews uses it, Hebrews 7:5 and 7:23. So as an example, middle of page 3, first Hebrews passage. And those descendants of Levites who received the priestly office have a commandment, and he goes on to say certain things. And then in verse 23 in Hebrews, he says they were prevented by death from continuing in office. So he uses that word multiple times, but the problem is that's a different Greek word, and you can see it written there. It's kind of hard to pronounce. It's Eretein, And it refers back to Old Testament priests. So we have 4 times the word office is used. All 4 of them are using a different word, and they're referring to priests. Okay, so now we move forward to 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. And it says, if anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. And you might think, well, you know, there's the office. Well, it's not the same word. And I want you to look at the bottom of page 4, and I want you to see 2 other translations. So at the top, you have the Berean literal, and this says this: the trustworthy is the same. If anyone aspires to overseership, he is desirous of a good thing. And the NIV says, here is a trustworthy saying, whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. So in other words, the NIV says that word office isn't even there. So what's going on here? What are our translators doing? Here's what's happening. You have the word episkopos. It's a noun, and it means overseer. Okay, so you have the word epi, across, skopos, or scope. It's someone who's looking across. It literally means an overseer. It's a perfect translation, right? This word is not episkopos, it's episkopes. And what it means, the Berean literal translation is the most accurate. It says anyone aspires to overseership. Now, the problem is that there's no such word in English. But it literally is one word, and it takes the noun of overseer and it converts it into a position. So overseer and overseership. So we say that in our language, we have a governor, and then we might refer to the governorship or something like that. We put the word ship on to take a noun and make it into a position. That's exactly what the Greek is doing here. So it's one word. So what does this actually mean? Well, it does mean a position of overseer. But the question is, or the issue is one of degree. Because just because a word is a position doesn't mean it's an office. So when you think of an office, like think of this as a scale. On the left, you have the position of office, which is, it's appointed, it's big, it's renowned, it's like the office of president, right? And then on the other side, you have a position. Like, I'm the janitor at the church. That's just a position. So what's happening here is you have this continuum of degree, and the people who believe it's an office, they're taking the fullest degree of that word, where it could just mean that it's an overseership. It's someone who has a position as an overseer. So I always ask people, well, what do you mean when you say office? And what they normally mean is that it's an appointed, titled, prominent position or high position. And I'm not so sure that the word means that. Okay, so it's not clear that this word, overseership, episkopes, transfers over to the word diakonos. And even if it does, it's not even clear that this word episkopes means an actual office. So when people say the office of pastor or deacon, I'm just like, I mean, it could mean that, but I don't think it does. Now, any pushback on this so far?
On the Berean literal, where it says if anyone aspires to overseership, he is desirous. So that means only a male.
Well,
An overseer.
sure, except for that the Greek language uses that all the time, where it refers to all men. You know, all men can place their faith in the Lord and be saved, but it really means all people. So that's not always the best way to determine that, is by the use of pronouns.
But it is talking about being faithful to his wife.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's talking about.
So then you can transfer that one to the wife.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think he's talking about men, but what I'm saying is I don't think you can make the argument just based upon the pronoun in Greek. Because, you know, even say in like you watch the intro to Star Trek, you know, to boldly go where no man has gone before. And that's not what they meant. When they said man, they meant humankind. And that's the way the Greek language works. Okay. So the reason, and we're off topic a little bit here as far as our church, the reason why we don't have deacons officially is because I don't think it's an office and I don't think it's a titled position. Now, if I went to a church and they had deacons, would I have an art? No, I'd be like, okay, that's cool. We can have deacons. My question always is, what do deacons do? Because you hardly find anything in the New Testament as to what deacons are supposed to do. So anything you have them do is usually going to be made up, which is fine. But I think a deacon, based upon the etymology of the word, is a servant leader. And to me, the issue of whether a deacon can be a woman or a man is irrelevant because it's a servant leadership position. So if you have a children's director, a men's ministry director, a director of the food pantry, in my opinion, these are biblical deacons. They're servant leadership positions that are not an office that's, this big thing. It's just a position of service. So that's my take on it. The larger portion of Christendom disagrees with me, and that's okay.
And probably one of the reasons is that when you have just leadership, it really states in here, they have certain qualifications. And they go, kind of background stuff and everything else, but in a church that doesn't have that, how do you determine that they have those qualifications in leadership?
Well, that's exactly it. If we're going to appoint someone to head up a ministry, then this still applies. Because we're saying that a deacon is just a servant leader, and if we appoint them to a position, then they better meet at a basic level these qualifications. But like I said, if a church has deacons and they name them, who cares? It doesn't matter to me. But okay, so the point here is, if we look down to a summary, it's not clear whether Paul is referring to wives or women. It's not clear whether Paul meant wives, women as a possessive noun. I don't think back to the ordained thing. There's no ordination in the New Testament anywhere. Okay? Doesn't exist. There's no such thing as ordination. So we do it for legal purposes, but biblically, if we erased the United States tax code and other things, there's no ordination for New Testament people. Unless you're going to say ordination just means appoint, then yes. Okay? Like if we lay on our hands on the youth team before they go on a mission trip, if by ordination you mean affirm, yes, we have that. If you mean appoint, then yes. But ordination as it's connected to the Old Testament, when they ordained prophets, priests, and kings, no. It's not in the New Testament. Okay, so all this to say that if women can, whether women or not can be deacons or not, is just this huge mess depending upon whether you think it's an ordained office. Now, if a deacon is an office and it's an ordained office, as it is in many churches, and it's just like the overseer, then probably women shouldn't be serving as deacons, because it's on the same level, at least as far as ordination, as the pastorate. So when I hear that we have women deacons, you don't think automatically this means a liberal church. Okay. All right. So was this like a big fun mess? Sorry. But really, this is what we're dealing with here, it's just, I wish I could come to you and just say, this is the answer. And you'll go to churches and they'll say, this is the answer. But look at the translations. They're different. So I'm just, giving you the options. Okay. So that doesn't really answer anything as far as ordination and women. But let's move now to the next one. We're at 1 Corinthians 11, and this is our second to the last position or our verse that we're going to consider. Okay, so 1 Corinthians 11, verses 2 to 16. We're going back into the Bible, backwards. If you remember, Paul wrote, as far as we know, 4 letters to the church at Corinth. 1 Corinthians is actually letter number 2. He made visits there. He sent Timothy there. The church was a mess. It was one of the biggest, ugliest, messiest churches. And Paul wrote the letter for 3 reasons. 1 is he had to confront them on their gross immorality. And 2, he needed to answer some of their questions. So in chapter 11, Paul is in the section of the letter where he's answering questions that they have asked. And what we begin is the purpose of these few chapters is to answer their questions. Now, if we go down to the bottom of page 4, my statement here is that 1 Corinthians represents a prime example of a correspondence that is so obscured by the massive cultural gap that one can hardly determine what Paul means. Nonetheless, the context of Paul's instruction is that without compromising truth, we should coexist with our secular communities and give no offense. So at the top of page 5, he says this in chapter 10. If somebody would read that passage at the top of page 5.
Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do. 1 Corinthians 10:24.
Okay, so this is the context. He's talking about, guys, can we just get along and not make waves and not ruffle feathers and do what we can to try to get along with everyone? So that brings us to this section. Okay, so Paul has some strange things to say about women, about head coverings and so on, but there's something else I want to bring up. This is a book written by Bruce Winter called Roman Wives, Roman Widows. And in the book, Winter argues that Paul was responding to a cultural phenomenon. So his research shows that in first century Rome, there was an explosion of femininity that burst onto the scene, kind of like, say, in the 1920s with like the flappers. We've got different waves of feminism. And you might say, well, how does something burst onto the scene? Look at DEI and the intersectionality ladder and how quickly that just exploded onto the scene in U.S. culture. It was like out of nowhere. Now, it was in the academic journals for a long time, but the public, all of a sudden, boom, in 2020, it just hit, right? So this was a similar thing that just exploded, and in Roman culture, you were what you wore. You can, in our culture, you have a guy who's worth $10 million. He can walk in here wearing jeans and a t-shirt. No one's going to know. Like, we do not reflect our status or our wealth by what we wear. In this culture, you did. So these new wives were characterized by a lifestyle that differed considerably from that of the traditional image of a modest wife. They broke tradition, they cast off restraint, and they dressed in ways that they might have considered to be liberating and gave them an appearance of having low morals. And so what he thinks is that this appearance, this cultural explosion, creates the precedent that would cause Paul to make some of these seemingly odd statements in 1 Corinthians 11. And what he's saying is that basically Beyonce and Lady Gaga were doing a bunch of stuff and everyone thought it was cool, so the women in the church started doing it. And Paul's like, whoa, 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 we can't be doing that. So let's read what he has to say. We're in 1 Corinthians 11, verses 2 to 16. Now I commend you, because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. And every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and the glory of God, but a woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. And neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. And that is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman. And all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray or to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. And if anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. Okay. This is a tough one, and I'll just tell you right now that we just can't deal with this because it's just a lot here. But it's kind of a mess. So what he's going to do, the first thing he's going to establish, notice that he praises them for keeping the traditions that he's delivered to them. This is a good thing. But we move into his first statement in verse 3 when he says, I want you to understand, and notice he's not making a statement about culture or dress. This seems to be the principle upon which he's proceeding. Verse 3, the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Now, at the bottom, at the top of page 6, you're going to see a graph. You'll see it on the screen here as well. Does anybody recognize this? This comes from Bill Gothard, who I'm not endorsing. I'm just saying this is what's out there. From the Institute of Basic Life Principles. He traveled the country in the 60s, taught seminars, and this was his graphical understanding of the relationship between husbands and wives. And so there you have Christ who covers everyone, but the husband covers the wife, and then the wife covers the children and the home. And so this was supposed to be, the way it's set up. Gothard, of course, was both conservative, overly conservative, and legalistic, and the graph has been a subject of much ire and controversy. Here's one that's maybe a little better as far as the art is concerned. But the idea of headship actually comes from the Bible, and whether you like Bill Gothard or not, doesn't negate whether this graph is true. So let's look at some verses. If I could have some people read, we're at the middle of page 6. These are verses that talk about headship. Could we have someone just kind of read through these? Who would take the first one?
I will make him a helper fit for him, and whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. And the man said, she shall be called woman because she was taken from man.
Okay, notice it doesn't use the word headship, but it basically says that she was made as a helper and that he had authority over the garden to name things, and then he named her. So it doesn't say headship, but it establishes some sort of inequality in authority. Now let's go to 1 Peter. Who wants the long one?
Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. When they see your respectful and pure conduct, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hope in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered.
Okay, pretty strong statements there. Okay. So he talks about Sarah submitting to her husband and calling him Lord. And but it says that husbands, it implies that if you mistreat your wives, your prayers are going to be hindered. So God takes this pretty seriously. But the opening statement is be subject to your husbands. Okay, so let's move on. 1 Peter, next page. Here's a couple of short ones. If we could have some people run through these.
Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Colossians 3:18.
Train the young women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind, and submissive to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be reviled.
Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Ephesians 5:22.
Okay, and then the last one is 1 Corinthians, which we've read. So you've got a lot of verses that talk about this, and I think one of the first questions that we might ask is, can these passages lead to abuse. Of course, yeah. Anytime you have an imbalance of power. Parents, can they abuse their children? Yes. Can police officers abuse their authority? Yes. Can pastors abuse their authority? Yes. Can husbands abuse their authority? Can a UFC fighter going into a bar abuse his authority? Yes. Can presidents? I mean, anytime there is an imbalance of power, you have the ability to abuse your authority. So that's true, but just because it can be abused doesn't mean it is, and it also doesn't mean it's bad. So, and this does not, just to be clear, submission doesn't mean obedience. No woman is forced to stay when her life is in danger. That's not what the scripture is talking about. And there are other passages that would talk about this. But it just means, as a general rule, the man is the head, and it uses that word head a bunch of times. The Greek word is kephale, which we'll get into. So what does this have to do with the complementarian debate here?
Forgot what the complementarian debate was.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I know, we get so deep in, you sometimes forget. It's like reading Arabian Nights, if you've ever read that. It's a story within a story within a story, and you just get deep, and you forget the original one. But basically, what this means is that, remember, according to Galatians, was it 3:28, the Magna Carta of equality in the Bible, that there's no male or female, there's no difference in role or position or value, and so. But you have a problem here, because over and over and over again, it says, wives, submit to your husbands, and that the man is the head of his wife. And he says that both in Ephesians and 1 Corinthians. So, anyway, so let's take this back now to 1 Corinthians 11, and I have on the bottom, near the bottom of page 7, the problem. And the problem is that Paul is communicating is that we need to have orderly meetings, and that we need to coexist with our secular culture. And if you believe Bruce Winters, then we have local women who were rebelling culturally through their dress. So Paul is saying, we got some women causing some trouble in the culture, we want orderly services, and we don't want to offend anyone. So he has a solution, and his solution begins with a principle. His principle is that a woman's created glory is a covered head. Now, whether you like this or not, when men are attracted to women, one of the things that men like is hair. They'll say, oh, look at the hair. Like, that's a thing. Women know that. How much money do women spend getting their hair looking nice? So both genders agree there's something about the woman's hair. Okay? And again, whether we like it or not, that's a thing. So there's something about a woman and her hair which is her glory. Now, in cultures where they are trying to not be as bad, like when an army comes in and they capture women who are spies, and the culture is at least moral enough not to sexually abuse them, what do they do to women to shame them?
Shave their head.
Every time they shave their head. They did that during World War II. Okay? So it is a way to shame them because there's something about a woman's hair. Like, you shave my head, I'm like, I don't care. It's going to be this long in like a month again. Like, that's like dudes, when we get lice, we're like, oh, okay, it's gone, right? But for women, it's traumatizing because you can't do that, or you won't do that. So there's something about a woman's head, and Paul seems to think that a woman was created with this glorious covering for her head, but man was created to have his head uncovered. And this is why I don't like the Shroud of Turin. There's a bunch of reasons I don't buy it at all, but also Paul says that it's a shame for a man to have long hair. I don't think Jesus had long hair. Every painting, every show, he's got this shaggy thing, and I don't think that was the case. I think he would have had, not short, because it would have been hard to cut hair all the time, but I don't think he would have had like his locks coming down here, like Thor or something. When they're like, Jesus, and he's all, yes, like this, come on. And then imagine, we have to picture Jesus good looking, so imagine if he had the long hair, and then he was bald, so he had like the thing like this, and then it went down, or he looked like Krusty the Clown, right? because we couldn't accept a follically challenged Jesus for whatever reason. All right, so what's Paul's solution here? He says that a woman should have a symbol of authority on her head because she is under the authority of her husband, and she should have a symbol of authority on her head. But he closes, and this is interesting, by basically saying that a woman who's properly submitted, that is, that has a symbol of authority on her head, can in fact pray or prophesy. Because you look at verse 5. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovers dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. Okay? So he seems to think that as long as her head is covered, that she can pray or prophesy. Now, before we go further, I want to look at some egalitarian acrobats on the top of page 8. So what you have is a Greek word, kephale, and kephale is the word for head. So that's what we translate, that the husband is the head of the wife. Well, there's a guy by the name of Philip Payne. He's an egalitarian writing, and he declares rather triumphantly that the majority view in recent scholarship has shifted to understand head in the passage to mean source rather than authority. And then he goes on to offer 15 reasons why source is the preferred translation. So what he does is he goes back etymologically into the history of the word, into classical Greek, and he says that this word kephale can also mean source. And so the husband is the source of the wife.
I didn't make her.
Well, she came from him in the rib, right? So, meaning the authority now has, because if you take Galatians 3:28, there's no more male and female, it has to mean something else. Kephale in the old world could mean source, so you knock it back down. Now, D.A. Carson comes along and says this is an exegetical fallacy called semantic obsolescence, basically saying that you can't go back to how a word was used 200 years ago to describe how it's used today. Just like the word Catholic. The word Catholic means universal, but that's not the way people use it. They mean the Catholic Church when they say Catholic. And just like the word gay, while we're on that topic, used to mean happy. Now it means something else. So it's irrelevant how a word was used 200 years ago. So in other words, the other scholars come in and say that's ridiculous. It was used to describe headship in the New Testament time. It doesn't matter how it was used 200 years ago. And then it's also consistent with the context because he's referring to the physical head of the woman and then the metaphorical head of the woman, which totally fits. So that's the egalitarian acrobats here to try to get it to say something else. So here is my conclusion, middle of page 8. Based upon the comparison between God, Christ, man, and woman, there is indeed a role difference between the genders. Even though 1 Corinthians 11 does not say anything explicit about women in ministry, it does help establish that there is indeed some kind of assumed role difference between the genders. The most significant contribution to the debate is that 1 Corinthians 11 allows for women to speak in public service, so as long as they do it in a way that does not break biblical roles. And so what I see here is this passage, it dismantles egalitarianism because there is a role difference, and it dismantles hard complementarianism that would say a woman cannot be on stage, she cannot read scripture, she cannot lead music, she cannot make announcements, she needs to be in the pew and being quiet. But Paul seems to indicate as long as she's in submission, then she has the ability to speak. Now, some of you might be saying, I feel a little unfulfilled based upon what you just said and what I just read here, because we haven't even addressed the head covering issues. Well, my suggestion is that Mike Winger covers this issue at length. Now, the thing about Mike Winger is that I trust him, and he's very good at doing the same thing. He has the same approach that I do, where he says, here's what it says, and here's the different options, and he's not trying to ram his belief down your throat. The problem with Mike Winger is that he does a lecture series on women in ministry, and I think it's like 45 hours. Okay, so I think the video just on chapter 11, on just the head covering issue, I think it's 6 hours. 6 hours and 45 minutes. Okay, but he's going to go in depth. So if you're in the car driving, bump it to 1.25 speed and listen to him because he'll unpack it. I obviously don't think that a woman is required to wear a head covering in church because I don't have my daughters do it and I don't ask my wife to do it. So the complementarian answer is, and the egalitarian answer, is that this was a cultural thing. That in other words, if the women outside of the church were doing crazy things to cast off authority, Paul is saying we're not going to be like them. Let's keep the head coverings on because that is what noble, modest, godly women do. But it was a cultural thing that does not apply. Like, for instance, we don't greet each other with a holy kiss. And we don't do foot washing because those have also been relegated to a cultural thing. All right. Yes? Oh, no.
Some do the foot washing.
So no one would say that it's wrong, but I think most Christians would say that it's not an ordinance. It's not something we're required to do. The foot washing was an act of service that at that time culturally you would do when someone came into your home. In our culture, we don't do that. So the way you make the application bridge is, are you willing to do a lowly service to serve your fellow person? And this could be going into the hospital and you're visiting someone and you have to change their bedpan, or maybe you need to clip their nails, or maybe somebody clogged the toilet. So there's gross, low things that we don't like doing. Are you willing to do those things? And I think that's the application. Now, certainly some disagree. And I've been at foot washing services before. Yes, Joe?
Yeah, it's kind of like the head covering thing too. Like, if you do that, you're not wrong either. I think it's kind of per your conviction. I wanted to know what Mike Winger said about it, so I watched that video over time, and because I was just like, are we doing all this wrong? Like, are the old brethren and the German Baptist guys like the ones that are correct on this? I wanted to know, and he basically said the same thing. Do your conviction. Don't. It's not wrong or right. It's just it's not ordered for us though, like you just said.
Yeah.
From what Mike Winger draws a conclusion, he did a deep search. So.
All right. So there's.
I will say,
Yeah.
when we were in India in Christian churches, we wore a head cover, and all their women did, and that was in a Christian church. But that's their culture.
To this day, I think there's
If you're in
typical
church,
culture,
you cover
non-Christians
your
also
head.
wears head coverings just regularly anyways. I think their typical culture, non-Christian, women wear head coverings
Right.
anyways.
But
I think when they're
it is a cultural thing. Like, even as we went, even when we went around town, we did not have to have a head cover. But when we went in church, we wore.
I would say this is a good rule too, that if you're going to another country and you're going into a service, submit to the culture of that service within biblical grounds. So if it's like, as a dude, you have to wear a tie, just put one on. Like, don't cause any fuss. That's exactly what Paul is saying here. Don't cause, yeah, but I have my right. No, just go in and don't ruffle feathers. Put the head covering on, right? And just do it. That's what he's saying here. All right, now, again, the way this goes back to our debate is it shows that there is a headship, non-headship relationship between husbands and wives, but it also shows, or it indicates, that there is a place for a woman to speak in church. The problem is, next week, in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul's going to say the women have to stay silent. They can't talk in church. So what is Paul talking about? Well, we'll have to figure that out. Now, by the way, if you want Mike Winger's video, this is a QR code, so that will take you to it. And then this is if you just want to type it in manually. So, well, we have made it through almost all of the passages. We have one more, 1 Corinthians 14. And, any final questions on this? Thanks, Joe. Where were you when I needed that earlier? All right, let me pray, and we'll get out of here. Lord, we have to learn to live with unclear answers. That's part of life. We don't understand free will and sovereignty. We don't understand Jesus being fully God, fully man. There's so many things that we don't understand.